In this video, I'm going to share with you a rather strange conflict resolution strategy that you've probably never heard of before. And the reason for that is it's derived from one of the universal laws known as the law of conservation. Now, before I explain what the law of conservation is and how it plays out in conflict, probably the best way to explain this is to share with you an intimate story of a very long conflict that I went through wherein millions and millions of dollars were at stake, and how I used the law of conservation to ultimately come out on top and achieve my desired outcome. At the end of the story, we'll kind of deconstruct it, analyze it, so that you'll be able to utilize the law of conservation in your own conflicts going forward and ultimately get what you want. So let's rewind just a few short years ago. My business partner and I at the time had decided that we needed to go our own separate ways. We had kind of realized through conversations that we had two very, very different visions of where we want to take the company, and ultimately only one of us could really, drive this thing. And so the challenge was that both of us wanted to keep the company, which ultimately meant that there had to be some sort of a conflict in order to decide who was going to end up with the business at the end of it. So that began what later became an 8-month legal battle over who was going to ultimately end up with the business. Now, going into this, I knew that I did not want to allow my emotions to get the best of me in the negotiation process. I realized that when emotions are high, intelligence tends to be low. And if I am going to start reacting in this conflict emotionally, then I am very unlikely to get what I want. I'm probably going to make some decisions or exhibit some behaviors that I'm going to regret later. And so I want to make sure that I was best as possible able to keep my head on straight, even though that I knew that we were going into what was inevitably going to be a pretty long, conflict to resolve. And so knowing that in advance, here's what I did is, every time that I heard something from that other party, whether it was hearing some of the things that they were saying about me behind my back to people that we knew, or whether it was, things that they were going to demand in the buyout agreement, or things that I heard through other people that were involved in the negotiation process, and those things would, get me charged up emotionally. What I would do is, as soon as I would notice that emotional charge coming on, as soon as I would feel myself getting angry or frustrated or resentful, I would pause and I would ask myself, okay, well, what am I experiencing right now? More importantly, what am I judging about that person? So let's say that, I'm judging them as being dishonest or stubborn or selfish. Well, I'd write down those traits or those characteristics that I'm judging about them, and then next to each one of those, I would start to ask myself, okay, well, where in my life have I exhibited that same trait? Where in my life have I been dishonest? Where in my life have I been stubborn? Where in my life have I been selfish? And I would literally start to take inventory of the ways in my life that I had shown up in that way. And what happens then as a result is I begin to, diminish the emotional response. In fact, not only am I diminishing the emotions that are coming up, but to a degree, I'm even able to experience empathy for the person on the other side of this, where I can see like, oh man, I can totally see where they're coming from here. And that allows me to go into the conversations or to respond to some of the things that were coming at me legally, to respond to those things from a more balanced and poised perspective, to not allow my emotions to get the best of me, but to really keep a level head throughout the process. Fast forward about 8 months later, we've gone through a pretty considerable legal battle. There was lots of legal fees on both sides, but ultimately I was able to achieve the desired outcome that I wanted, which was to be able to keep the business, keep the customers, keep the products, keep some of the assets related to the business, and to achieve all of that at a quote unquote fair price. So let's kind of deconstruct what I'm talking about here for a moment. So why is it that, as I get charged up about this other person, why am I taking the time to really, give a label to the things that I'm experiencing about them or judging about them? And then why am I going even a step further and really, taking inventory of how I've shown up that way in my life as well? Well, this is all related to the law of conservation, which we've all heard of. It's just that most of us haven't heard of it in that exact term or phrase. So what is the law of conservation? Well, the law of conservation means that everything in the universe is made up of energy, as we know. And the law of energy is that energy can't be created or destroyed. It can only transform. In other words, all that is today is all that ever was and all that will ever be. All we're going to experience is different forms of it as it, evolves as the universe continues to age in time. That's the law of conservation. Now, that is also true for the world outside of us and the world inside of us. It's our outer world and our inner world. In other words, in our inner world, everything that can exist in a human being does exist in a human being. What do I mean? Well, let's take as an example that in the Oxford Dictionary, there's about 4,600 human characteristics and traits. And every single human being has all of them. Whether we want to admit it to ourselves or not, every human being is, both kind and cruel, positive and negative, honest and dishonest, animal and angelic, peaceful and wrathful, giving and taking, so on and so forth. When we understand that, what we realize is that what we're experiencing amongst people is that everything exists. All of the traits exist. It just exists in almost 8 billion different forms right now. That's the variance. But whatever we can perceive in someone else is also true about ourselves. Now let's take it one step further. What is conflict? Well, conflict ultimately stems from some form of a resentment. So at some point, somebody says or does, or doesn't say or doesn't do something that we resent, or they take a stance or a position that maybe we resent. So it stems from some sort of perceived action or inaction, or maybe a perceived stance that they take that we see as opposing our stance, our view, or what we think that they should have done, ought to have done, or were supposed to do in that situation. Ultimately, conflict stems from resentment. Now, what is resentment? Well, resentment stems from judgment. When we resent somebody, what's ultimately happening is that we are judging them for something. Now, typically what we're doing is we're judging them as displaying a certain characteristic or trait that we have disowned about ourselves. So when we judge somebody, what we're really doing is saying that they're this way and I'm not. We put them in the pit, we put ourselves on the pedestal, right? And we look down on them. And then as we look down on them, all of these emotions start to come up. And that's where all the emotions turn into, anger, frustration, the desire for revenge and all these sorts of things. So let's start to break this down. When we judge someone, what's really happening, as I mentioned, is that we are seeing or perceiving our own disowned parts. So when we judge somebody as something, the emotion that's coming up behind that is really the result of us disowning that part within ourselves. So if I judge you as dishonest, or in this case, the business partner, when I'm judging him as being dishonest or stubborn or selfish, what's really happening, I have the awareness of knowing that what's really happening is I am disowning that part of myself, and that's why I'm judging it, right? So I'm saying that they're that way and I'm not, and I'm looking down on them from kind of the high horse, right? But we also know that every human being has every characteristic and trait that can possibly exist. So it's just an imbalanced perception. So when I take the time to say, okay, what am I, perceiving about this person? Well, actually, let's even take it a step back before we go there. When the emotions come up, that's a sign that the amygdala is firing. It's kind of the oldest portion of the brain. It's the emotional center of the brain. When that comes up, we are just in fight or flight. That's all the purpose that it serves. So if we're in conflict, well, then we're probably in fight mode. And it stems from an emotional component of the brain. Now, the challenge with emotions is that in that portion of the brain, in the amygdala, we're not using kind of the higher functions of the brain. And we want to be able to get out of that. So one of the first things that I want to do is called name it to tame it. In other words, I want to assign a label to the thing that I'm judging about that person. The reason that this works is it takes us out of the amygdala and it basically brings the limbic brain online. The limbic brain is the part of the brain where we start to process language. So when we name it to tame it, when we feel all of those emotions, we're charged up at somebody, we're frustrated, we're angry, we have a hard time verbalizing exactly what it is that we're angry about. We can talk about what they did or they didn't do, but to really put a label on it and assign it something so that we can define it becomes difficult. But when we do, we start to step out of the amygdala and into the limbic brain. And that's why I would take the inventory and say, okay, well, he's being, dishonest or stubborn or selfish. And that alone will start to tame the amygdala. Now, the next step is then to bring the prefrontal cortex online. The prefrontal cortex is where we do all of our rational and logical thinking. And it's going to be the best portion of the brain to use in order to navigate a conflict. Because that's how we're going to stay centered and balanced and poised rather than poisoned in the process. So in that portion, now I'm bringing the prefrontal cortex online by asking, okay, where in my life have I exhibited that same behavior? And now I'm going through and taking inventory and owning my disowned parts. So one might even say that conflict or resentment is actually a gift, because it gives us the opportunity to become aware of the parts of ourselves that we've disowned over time. And a question might be, how can we love ourselves when we're disowning parts of ourselves? As we begin to gain more love and respect, self-esteem for ourselves, we're better able to approach a conflict or a situation more level-headed, more balanced, more poised rather than poisoned, more magnetic rather than manic, and to stay clear, grounded, and certain, and focused on the desired outcome, as opposed to being swept up in all of the emotions that can potentially come along with it. And that is why I use this strategy every day in my life that I experience conflict. As soon as I feel those emotions come up, I'll ask myself, okay, well, what am I judging about that person? And I'm looking for the characteristics or traits that I'm judging about them. And then the next question is, okay, well, where in my life have I exhibited those characteristics and traits? And I realized that this is really two parts. I get the grateful opportunity to learn to love myself more wholly. And I get the opportunity to respond to that person or that situation rather than to react. To stay level-headed, to stay balanced, to stay poised, to stay clear, and to stay focused on the desired outcome. And now it doesn't matter what they do or how they react or the emotions that they go through, because I'm staying focused on only what it is that I want to get out of that situation. And because I'm able to stay balanced and poised, well, typically they're able to balance themselves and be more poised and be more rational throughout the process. And rather than being, two heads butting, we can really bring two heads together and resolve a conflict. So this is something that I use every day in my life. Hopefully you understand the value of this and you're able to begin executing and using this in your life, right? You feel the emotions, great. What am I experiencing? What am I judging about this person? And then take the time to take inventory where you've exhibited those same characteristics and traits in your life until such a point that you can realize that everything that you see out there also exists in here. And you have the opportunity to better love yourself for who you are. So listen, I hope you got value out of this, my friend. And if you're somebody who's smart, ambitious, driven, and you're looking for more success and want to become a better leader, well then go ahead and subscribe down below and hit that little bell button so that you get notified every week when I drop more content like this designed to help you create more success in your life and your business. And by the way, in case you're new to my channel, my name is Keala Kanae. I'm an entrepreneur that got started a few short years ago while working in a coffee shop for minimum wage, and I've gone on now to create multiple 7- and 8-figure businesses. And I say that so that you know that everything I share on my channel comes from the real world applied knowledge of the things that have helped me create those results, and I share them here in hopes that they help you create similar results as well. So make sure you subscribe, hit that little bell notification, and by the way, make sure you watch one of these 2 videos that are about to pop up. You can learn more about how to build success in your life and your business. I look forward to seeing you down the road. Subscribe, hit that bell button, and I'll see you later.